Sean Gander here with Simplify. I wrote a blog back in 2021 on the Living Out Allowance, and it has had more traffic than any other page on my website for the past 3 years. And so I figured I should do a video on Living Out Allowance because obviously there is some interest out there. What is Living Out Allowance? Or subsistence, LOA, couple different names for it. It's essentially a tax-free meals and lodging allowance. Who's this video for? It's for all you oil and gas contractors that hate paying taxes. Because let's admit it, we get taxed on pretty much everything in Canada. And this could also be for those trades, construction companies, other small business owners who have employees that they want to pay a Living Out Allowance to, or they want to pay it out to themselves as a tax-free allowance. It can go across industries, but we see this a lot in the oil and gas industry. Who is this not for? It's not for you if you are an employee of a large company that you do not own, such as let's say that you receive a T4 from ARC Resources, you're an employee of theirs. Really, it's up to between you and them and the employment contract you have on whether or not they pay you an LOA. And if they do, it's up to them to determine whether or not the criteria for it being tax-free is met. And here's the kicker. If they determine that, hey, look, we think this is a tax-free allowance, we're giving you 30% of your day rate, or we're giving you whatever. If that criteria isn't actually met, if the CRA audits that company and determines it's not met, then you could have to pay taxes on all of that tax-free money that you received for several years. And so if you want to keep watching this video just to determine, well, what is that criteria that needs to be met? So then you could maybe talk to your employer and be like, hey, look, I don't think I meet this criteria. But let's be honest, if you're getting it tax-free, are you going to talk to your employer about it? Probably not. Let's walk through this. How much can you get and what criteria do you need to meet? Before I talk about how much you can get, I want to talk about the criteria because it's really important. If you don't meet the criteria, it doesn't matter how much you get, it's not tax-free. So there's a subsection of the Income Tax Act that allows you to receive this exception to be able to receive these items tax-free. And this subsection of the Income Tax Act tells you that you can get a tax-free allowance if you are at a special work site or a remote work location. What's a special work site? You have to meet all of the following conditions. 1, the employee, i.e. you or your employee, was required to be away from home. The work at the special site was temporary. The employee maintained at a home at another location which was available for them to use and wasn't rented to someone else. And due to distance, it wasn't reasonable that the employee could return on a daily basis. The employee also had to be away for at least 36 hours. And if all of these conditions are met, then a TD4 form must be completed to exclude these benefits from the T4. Quite a few different conditions there. As an example, let's say that you live in Calgary. Let's say that you rent or own a home in Calgary, that it's available for your use, i.e. you're not renting it out to someone else, but you can go back there whenever you want, and you're working at a special work site in, call it Grand Prairie. That special work site has to be temporary. So let's say there's some kind of pipeline job up in Northern Alberta or Northern BC where you have to go and work. You have to be away for at least 36 hours. It's not reasonable for you to drive 5, 6 hours, 7, 8 hours home to Calgary. That could be a special work site. You could get a reasonable tax-free allowance for that as long as you meet all those conditions, have that TD4 form signed by you and your employer. The other option is a remote work location. Remote work locations are a bit harder to meet the condition for. A work location is remote if it's over 80 kilometers from a established community of over 1,000 people. So that's pretty tiny. 1,000 people is a very small community, and you have to be within 80 kilometers of that. So it's pretty rare to meet that condition of a remote work location, but it can be met. You essentially have to be in the middle of nowhere. The criteria that you need to meet, the conditions you need to meet, is it's not reasonable for you to set up or maintain your own housing because the location is so remote. You weren't provided accommodations by an employer, and you're away for at least 36 hours. And for remote work locations, you don't need to complete that TD4 form. So that's a bonus. If you're working for an oil and gas company As a contractor, as an employee, whatever that might look like, if they're providing a camp for you to stay in, you can't get a tax-free living out allowance for lodging because they're providing you with a camp. You're not going to get taxed on the value of that camp because you meet these conditions, but you can't get an additional allowance on top of that. You have to actually be paying for some kind of lodging or proof that, you're staying somewhere else. And the biggest thing about these things too, we see this all the time with oil and gas contractors, is that you have to personally be incurring expenses. Like, let's say that you're a welder who has a company, you're the employee of your company. Well, if you're running all the hotel expenses and the meal expenses, etc., through your company, you don't qualify to pay yourself a living out allowance from your company that's tax-free, because your company's paying for all the expenses. So you have to choose. Are you going to pay yourself a tax-free living out allowance? Try to make sure you meet all these conditions, document that you meet all these conditions, risk a CRA audit, or do you want to just run the expenses through your company and claim them? A lot of times it's actually more beneficial just to run the expenses through your company and claim them than to play around with paying yourself a living out allowance. If you pay yourself a living out allowance that the CRA deems unreasonable, they'll deny the entire thing and you'll get taxed on the entire thing. Then if you're running expenses through your company that you shouldn't as well, there could be double taxation. And so you have to be really careful. What is reasonable? What can you claim? Subsection 6 of the Income Tax Act doesn't give you any values. It just says it has to be reasonable, which can be really difficult because what's reasonable in Fairview, Alberta versus maybe Toronto might be totally different. But some guidance that you can go off of, there was a 2020 Court of Canada case where the CRA deemed $135 per day to be reasonable. There are also rates posted by Canada's National Joint Council, which goes over essentially the rates that CRA agents get when traveling. So you could argue those as being reasonable. And those rates, if you add them all up, it comes out to about $180 a day. But that's if you keep meal receipts. If you don't keep meal receipts, then the max you can get for meals is $23 a meal, up to 3 meals per day, which is $69 a day for meals, which isn't a ton. And so if you add that $69 a day with the $50 that they give you for private accommodations with $17 for incidentals, that's $136 a day, which is pretty close to their $135 a day that they claimed as reasonable back in 2020. Now, if you have proof, like let's say that you personally were paying $300 a day for hotels and you have those receipts and you can claim, well, my company paid me $400 as a tax-free living allowance, but I personally paid $80 for meals, $300 for hotels, and $20 for incidentals, and then you can prove that, but you have to have the backup to prove that. Otherwise, it could get denied. Check out this awesome summary that I did just for you so that you can make sure you're meeting all the requirements for either a special work site or a remote work location exclusion, and so you can pay that tax-free living out allowance to yourself or your employees from your company. Something to note, super important, make sure you keep all the documentation to prove and back up that you meet these requirements, because if the CRA does audit your LOA claim, and then they'll want to see that. Another thing to note is that any LOA paid from one company to another company, that's not tax-free, that's taxable, but once it's paid out to the employees, as long as these criteria are met, then that can be tax-free. Hopefully this was useful. Lots of info jam-packed in here. I always talk to your accountant about your specific situation because it really depends on your situation. Some people, 100%, they can claim a living out allowance, but others, again, we just recommend run those expenses through your company as a business expense because there's more risk associated with claiming a tax-free living out allowance, and there's more conditions and documentation that you need to keep that just don't make it worth it. Until next time.